So next what we're going to do is hear from some of our experts on managing growth and planning for the future, and just doing an overview from our school system perspective. Dr. Orland from on a transportation basis, master plans from Gwen Wright. Why don't we start with Bruce?
Okay, thank you. Casey's demographics were a very good intro to my presentation, which is how we go about planning for schools. And I've got a PowerPoint here that I think I can page through. And I looked at the questions that came in during the last couple of weeks, and I've heard this many times myself, that there seems to be a concern or not an understanding of how we go beyond kind of the 6-year time frame of the capital budget, and are we really looking longer term at what our needs will be, and how well are we working with other agencies and planners in the county. And so the way I've organized this is sort of by time frame. We do plan long-term, and we do work very closely with planning agency and staff and elected officials. We look out to decades in certain ways in terms of future school sites and co-location opportunities. That constitutes sort of the long-range view, and we're very much involved in master plans and sector plans that look out that far. The 6-year period is when we get down to the details of what does the forecast show that we need to build in terms of keeping up with growth, and that we can justify the county providing funding for over the next 6 years. And then we have a 1-year time frame as well, which is the time frame within which we work with the planning board staff on the subdivision staging policy, which can put a brake on development if we're getting too far ahead of ourselves in terms of enrollment versus adequate capacity. So let me go into a little more detail on those, and I know we're over time, so I'll go very fast. I'll have to look at my notes. I can't quite see that angle. So there is a lot of collaboration with the planning board staff, and our main interest in that process is two things. Ensuring that the planning staff and elected officials, as these master plans go forward, understand what we're currently facing in terms of school utilization and what's projected long term, so that there is an awareness as master plans and sector plans are approved of the current status of schools. And of course, the current status is in most cases overutilization. But the other key thing that that collaboration is important for is identifying school sites that will be needed in the future to accommodate the additional housing and students that will come out of those master plans and sector plans. If you look at all the schools we have in the county today, most of those schools came to the school system through dedication and through the master plan process. So we have 202 schools today. A few we had to purchase the sites for over the years, but I think it says something about the quality of the planning over the last 50 years or so that most of those schools were included in master plans and were dedicated properties. And that process goes on. Currently we have 14 future school sites in the board inventory, and 11 that are actually still set aside in master plans that will be dedicated when we get to the need for those. We do have a dilemma, of course, though. Most of the new development is not the classic greenfield suburban kind of development like Clarksburg is sort of the last master plan that qualified as large tracts of land, and the ability to get sites in that kind of an environment is much simpler because you're dealing with large property owners who are contributing large amounts to enrollment. What we're faced with as we urbanize is much smaller property owners, very high value land, and trying to get sites in those sector plans is really one of the big challenges we're going to face as we continue to urbanize and promote smart growth. For instance, Bethesda, Shady Grove, and the White Flint plans are all challenging places to add sites. Okay? So that's something worth talking about as the day goes on. All right. Thank you. We also have a large inventory of closed schools, formerly operating schools. We dropped by 35,000 students in the 70s to the mid-80s. And most of those sites were retained. Fortunately, there was a period when we were surplusing sites, but for the most part, most of those are still in public ownership. And we've reopened many. Since 1989, we've reopened 15 formerly operating schools. We have 14 now still in board ownership, and we have 30 in county ownership. And most of those schools are leased to private providers, many private schools, worthwhile community things, but they can be reclaimed as needed for school system use. And obviously, we have done that 15 times. And the board has a practice now of holding on to all our sites, all our closed schools. Nothing is going away in terms of our inventory. And we have a few examples of how this plays out over time. We're opening 4 new schools in the next 6 years, and every one is sort of an example of that decades-type long-range planning coming into play. We're opening a middle school in Clarksburg that was dedicated and obtained through the Clarksburg Master Plan process. We have a new middle school opening in the BCC cluster. That was the former site of a school. When that school closed during the enrollment drop, it was turned over to a park, served very well for a park, but we were able to reclaim it now, and that school opened in August 2017. Richard Montgomery number 5 is opening on a former Hungerford Park site. It was turned over to the county, been used for a variety of purposes. It's being transferred back from the county. It'll open as an elementary school. Northwest number 8 is the last example. This was a case where we did not have a publicly owned site up in Germantown, so that site had to be purchased, and that school's opening in 2017. So there are, for the most part, long-range plans for siting schools in the county, either through future sites or former operating schools. Another thing that is very important to the school system is as land gets more scarce, we're looking at more co-location opportunities. That's been a long-standing practice with parks. We have 46 elementary schools, 12 middle, and 7 high schools that are co-located with parks. And that means that we don't need as big a footprint for the school site since we can share the land of the park for outdoor facilities. And you'll probably hear a lot more today about a study that MCPS, Park and Planning, and county agencies are engaged in, which is to look at long-term what co-location opportunities do we have with other public facilities over time. We have one example of that already. We have a middle school up in Germantown, Kingsview, co-located with a recreation center. So as we get more urbanized and we lose open tracts of land, we'll be looking at more of that, and that study is going on now. The next section is on the 6-year planning period. Oh, I've got the control, I forgot. Okay. Every year in the fall, new projections are developed, and they're developed for a 6-year period, which is aligned with the capital improvements programming period. A 10th and a 15th year is also projected, so we try to establish some kind of direction of enrollment long-term, but we have to justify in a 6-year period the need for funding from the county to build additional capacity or new schools. So that 6-year forecast is where what did Mr. Leggett say, the rubber meets the road. You know, that's when we're telling the county officials that we need the money in this period of time. And it determines whether we add classrooms, new schools, or expansions of schools when they're revitalized. We have a whole revitalization program which goes alongside new capacity. And most of those schools that are being revitalized are being expanded, so we're building them bigger. Forecasts are based on county births, migration to the population, to the county, aging of the student population. Mr. Casey talked about how we're seeing some communities age up and the kids move on from elementary to middle. And they're based on approved residential development. That is factored into the forecast. And here again, we have a lot of collaboration with county planning staff. And once the plans get the approval of the county, we're talking to the builders and the developers to know how many they're going to build at different points of time, what they see as the market, and then factoring that into the forecast where those students will go to school. One concern I've heard a lot is, well, this big master plan is going to generate many more kids than you're showing in the 6-year forecast. Why aren't you showing the whole impact of it and planning for that now? If you kind of extend that rationale further out, though, it'd be very difficult for us to justify building all the facilities that a sector plan or master plan may require in a 20 to 30 year build out and building them in a 6-year period. Hypothetically, then, you would have vacant schools sitting there waiting for the sector plan to build out. And certainly the county cannot afford that much proactive construction. We have needs that we're far behind on. And so it's important to know that we know as planning staff in the school system that these plans are out there and they're going to add a lot of students over time, but we have to move with the housing construction schedules and what we really will see in schools within a 6-year period. I can talk more about that because I know that's a frequent question throughout the day. And of course, the inventory of school sites helps us accommodate that. Just to give you an example of that kind of long-range build-out, the Clarksburg Master Plan was adopted in 1994. It's still not done being completed after 20 years. There's many more years before that plan will reach build-out. And the same scenario is expected for these sector plans with large amounts of housing units, White Flint, Shady Grove. They're not building out in 6 years by any stretch. Okay. Now, Mr. Anderson also talked about this. There is a perception, and I understand it, that new development is the source of enrollment growth pretty much completely. Now, I don't know if people literally believe that, but certainly a new high-rise in Bethesda or the subdivision is the most visible sign of growth. But there's much more impact of turnover of existing houses and demographic changes in communities than can be attributed to new housing. And one example of that is in 2014, about 11,000 existing homes turned over in the county, and about 3,800 new starts began. And an existing home turning over is at least as likely as a new home to have a family with children move in. In fact, it's probably more likely than a new home because more and more of the new homes that are being built, 60% in 2014 were multifamily condominiums and apartments where we see fewer numbers of students generated. So the impact of a lot of this new housing, and this is a very much debated point, will these high-rises and multifamilies along metro lines and so forth, will they begin to have families in them in the same kind of quantities that we see in single-family detached and townhouses? We haven't seen that yet, and today I can talk to you about that because I've got examples of the numbers of students we're seeing in those multifamily units. Okay. Now the next time frame is the 1 year. And this is where we work with the planning board and planning staff with the subdivision staging policy. This is the county's ability to put a brake on development. It's not going to stop it forever because the plans and the subdivisions will go forward. It's just an attempt to slow it down maybe a little bit and have the school system catch up. The policy is adopted every 4 years by the county council, and it's administered by the planning board. It has a methodology for assessing school utilizations, and it has gives the planning board the authority to condition or limit plan approvals. Currently, the test has two thresholds. If a cluster is over 105% utilized at any level, elementary, middle, or high, then if a developer wants approval, he has to make a payment called the school facility payment to get his plan approved. It's a pay-and-go kind of method, and that revenue goes into the pot for construction of capital projects in the cluster where it's collected. And it's 60% of the per-student costs that new development will have on the system. And then if it's over 120%, the cluster can be closed for a year to residential approvals. We have no cluster at that level at this point, but we have 16 that are over the 105% out of our 25, and facility payments are being collected in those clusters. Okay, just to wrap up, we're going to talk a lot about planning collaboration, I know, today, but I must say that the main constraint for us to keep up with enrollment growth boils down to there's insufficient revenue to address the magnitude of need. We need to find ways to get more revenue, state and county, if we want to get any more caught up than we are. As you know, the PTA folks that are here and parents, it's been the opposite for a number of years. Projects get delayed, rather than moved up. Another important final point is adding capacity is certainly important, but we have competing needs too in the system that have to be addressed, just like the county has to look at other things besides schools. We have to revitalize older schools that are getting obsolete, and we have to maintain those schools as we wait longer to revitalize them in terms of HVAC, roof replacements, and those systemic maintenance things. So there's a lot of places a limited pool of capital dollars can go. Thank you.
We're going to switch the order based on staff consultation. We're going to hear from Gwen Wright of our Planning Department so that we can get through all of our slides at once.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and use the mic over here. I'm going to do just a very quick overview about master plans in Montgomery County. I think you're a very knowledgeable group. You probably know as much, if not more, than all of us in the planning department about how master plans progress. But just to give a quick overview. You know, there's a long history of planning in Montgomery County. This is a very old map from the 1920s about the Maryland-Washington Metropolitan District. And it was a regional approach that was taken of corridors radiating out from the District of Columbia, not just in Montgomery County, but in Prince George's County and into Virginia, with a series of communities along those corridors. Montgomery County fully embraced that basic framework with our general plan on wedges and corridors. And we have our urban ring, our very strong corridors along 270, along 29. And we built out in that model very, very closely. Montgomery County over the years has held very much to this idea of wedges and corridors, and we've protected large environmental areas, including the Ag Reserve, which is over 9,000 acres of land. And we've created very important and stable single-family neighborhoods. When you take all of the environmental and the man-made constraints, and we consider the single-family neighborhoods, which are an important asset to the county, but are a constraint to development because we don't want to see them removed for new development, you really only end up with about 19% of the county that's still unconstrained in some way. And those are the areas that you see in white on this map. At the same time, and this is the same thing that Casey Anderson mentioned, we have anticipated growth. And the reality is that if that growth is going to occur, we need to think about how it's going to occur and where it's going to occur. In essence, what we're saying is our wedges and corridors really need to evolve into centers and boulevards. And we need to be thinking about smaller, more compact communities. So the challenges ahead for us in master planning include focusing on infill instead of greenfields, developing finer grained plans, putting the T in TOD so that we have the transit to serve these corridors, making sure that infrastructure keeps pace with growth, which is why we're all here today, addressing the need for affordable housing, providing those high-quality open spaces, including not just the large green areas in the Ag Reserve, but really great urban parks and public spaces, and making sure that each of our communities remain unique and very special. To do that, we're really looking at doing more and more of what are called small area master plans. They're a bit smaller than a sector plan. They aren't necessarily as small as what we're calling limited master plan amendments. They're areas like the recent Sandy Spring plan that was done, which was a subset of the Sandy Spring Ashton plan, but really focused on one particular community. And I think we're going to see more and more planning of that scale. It's important to think about what master plans can do, though, and what they can't. They absolutely identify community goals and needs, and we spend a lot of time talking with all of you and doing outreach to get your input on those goals and needs. They create a blueprint, they establish a long-term vision, they create a framework of streets and open spaces for a community, and they absolutely guide the implementation and regulatory processes. But what they don't is they don't require private owners to undertake development or renovation projects. They can't create a real estate market where one doesn't exist. And they really don't develop the detailed plans for capital improvements, such as roads and schools, or operational issues such as new traffic lights. It doesn't get down to that level of operational work. Our colleagues in the county executive branch agencies do get down to that level of detail based on guidance that is in master plans. The other thing, and it was just mentioned by Bruce, that plans don't usually get fully built out. For an example, the 1994 Bethesda plan allowed up to 27.8 million square feet after 21 years, and most people would feel that there's been a lot of construction and a lot of building in Bethesda. It still has not met, or it's still 4 million square feet less than what had been potentially contemplated in the 1994 plan. Another example is we've done 2 plans for Glenmont, 1997 and 2013. Has a metro station. We've tried to look at how to promote development near a metro station. However, the reality is that there has been literally 1 new private development in the vicinity of the Glenmont Metro in the past 30+ years. A rule of thumb that we sometimes use is that a very, very successful plan might have a 75% build out over 20 to 30 years. That would be a very, very successful plan. With a high level of construction. One of the things I also want to point out is sort of the role of master plans in the regulatory process. I think a lot of people really believe that if a project is, or a potential for development of a project is noted in a master plan, that the project will be there in a year or 2. The reality is our development process is pretty complicated in Montgomery County, and it starts with the master plan, certainly, and this particular example uses one particular site, the Pike and Rose property in White Flint. There was a master plan. It talked about how there was a framework of streets, and open spaces, and what could happen at this site. Then sectional map amendment followed, which gave the zoning to that property. Then the next step was a sketch plan, which required a greater level of detail, but was still conceptual about what might happen on the property, how the framework of streets would build out. Then there was a preliminary plan to actually subdivide the land into individual parcels and pieces. And then there was a site plan that got down to the details of exactly how that particular site would develop. Then it moved forward to construction, which required a series of building permits. And finally, it's what you see today. There are actually cranes and buildings being built. But the master plan, which is the start of that process, is really just the start. And then there are literally, even for a project that's sort of ready to go, there are years of approvals and construction before one resident or business ends up being in a particular property. That's a quick overview, very quick. I'm going to be here throughout the day today. Lots of folks from the planning department are here. We're glad to answer any questions you have about master planning and how we work with our colleagues in Montgomery County Public Schools, how we work with our colleagues at the Department of Transportation to deal with a lot of the important infrastructure issues that I know you all are very focused on today. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Councilmember Berlin.
Thank you, Gwen. I will now turn it over to Dr. Orland, who will do a comparable review of our transportation planning.
comparable but much shorter. I'm trying to bring us a little closer to schedule. If you learn nothing else out of this part of the presentation, just remember these 5 words. We need lots of money. All right? In transportation planning, most of the material I'm going to cover very briefly, and it's in your packet anyway, so look at those at your leisure, and all of us are going to be here all day, so just take us aside. In transportation, there's no shortage of planning. In state level, Maryland DOT spent the last more than a decade working on the Purple Line with lots of community input. The State Highway Administration has a very, very active program for community input and doing they call it project planning for a dozen to 15 projects in Montgomery County. However, there's very, very little that's under construction at the state level within Montgomery County. In fact, the only project that's underway right now is an interchange at Georgia Avenue and Randolph Road. There are a couple of other projects which are programmed to be built. One is a bypass around the historic town of Brookville. One is a new interchange at I-270 and Watkinsville Road. If you know where the new Kaiser Permanente unit is out there, it's right next to that. And of course, the biggest by far is the Purple Line, which actually all the funding is currently there if the current governor decides to go forward with it, which we're all sort of waiting for. There's at least a dozen projects, maybe 15, where the state has spent millions and millions of dollars doing planning and design, in some cases even buying right-of-way, for which there's no construction money. The total cost that we would need for those projects in the order of $2 billion just for those. In addition to that is the Corridor Cities Transitway, which is a busway which would run from Shady Grove through the King Farm and the Life Science Center up by the Kentlands into Metropolitan Grove and eventually to Clarksburg. The first piece of Metropolitan Grove is on the order of $600 million. The rest of it would be another $300 to $400 million. Again, there's no money in the state's program to build it. There's money in it to finish the planning and design, and there's money to buy some of the right-of-way, but nothing to build it. So there is, again, plenty of planning going on, a lot of community input, but we need lots of money. This county level, as Gwen mentioned, every master plan has a transportation element. We are looking out 30 years into the future to see whether or not the planned transportation will meet the planned amount of housing and jobs that are expected for the community or planned for the community. And there is, in most cases, that kind of a balance. What is the balance? Well, balance isn't good transportation. It's certainly not great transportation. It's adequate transportation. It's tolerable transportation. If anything, Casey mentioned this earlier, there have been, over a period of years, a tightening of the school tests. In other words, the amount of overcrowding in schools is not allowed to go as high as it had been in the past. In transportation, it's really gone a bit in the other direction. We're realizing that we can't afford to build everything we need to be able to build, and so we've allowed more congestion in our tests than we used to, and that's just reality. In terms of the funding part of the CIP, the Capital Improvements Program is a 6-year capital program. It has everything that the county itself spends money on to build something, whether it's a school or road, transit, library, rec center, police station, fire station, sewer, water line, park. Anything is in that. It's the current CIP, Capital Improvements Program, is $5.7 billion. It was approved last May, and we do it in whole cloth every 2 years, but we do amend it every year to the extent there are amendments coming forward, and we're going through that process right now. The council is, in terms of reviewing proposals from the school system, from the county executive, and others. And in this year, the off year for the CIP for anything to pass requires 6 affirmative votes. So that's all happening, and they'll make a final decision on the amendments in May. The CIP has many, many funding sources, almost 50. The biggest one by far is general obligation bonds, which are bonds backed by the full faith and credit of the county. That contributes 39–40% of the funding for the CIP. And the council, by charter, has to restrict how much spending there is on general obligation bond proceeds so as to limit debt service. And they recently approved spending affordability guidelines, which do that for this next 6 years. The other sources of revenue, about 17% are your water and sewer fees for WSSC projects. And there are smaller amounts for state aid that we expect, and we're afraid that's going to drop some given the current situation in Annapolis, as well as funds from impact taxes, the recordation taxes, and others. For schools, and that's the emphasis for a lot of this day, about 84% of the funding comes from county sources. So right now it's 16% from the state. It's about $240 million. We're asking for not only the $240 million, but an additional $214 million. So total of, do the math, 454 million over the next 6 years. It's going to be an uphill climb. We asked for a similar amount last year, and we were unsuccessful. This year, the economy, if anything, is not as good as it was last year, but we're still going to keep pushing on this, and we'll know the answer really within a month. The issue always comes up about how much should development pay. Been there, done that. 2007, the council changed the impact taxes for schools and for transportation and set it as a policy that both of them, in each of their spheres, would pay for about 90% of the cost of the additional capacity needed generated by that new development. And why 90? Because there's some other fees as well that hit new development. Recordation taxes hit new development to some degree. Some of it's based by us when we refinance our homes, but some by them. Also, we have something called the school facility payment, which Bruce alluded to, when a cluster is over 105% capacity, but under 120%. If the developer wants to go forward, he or she can do that if they pay this extra amount. And it's very complex, but it's on your worksheet. It's in the back of the funding page. It's all right there. These taxes are much, much higher than anywhere else in Maryland. And again, they are updated every 2 years by construction cost inflation. And it pays for the new capacity that's generated by the new development. Suffice it to say, what Bruce is saying is right. Most of the need for new schools does not come from new development at all. It comes from turnover and changes in demographics. The same thing's true to a degree with transportation. I don't have the figure in front of me, but a majority, not as large majorities for schools, but a majority of the need for transportation comes from just demographic change. More people own cars now than they used to per person. There's more through traffic, and there's just more of a combination of those types of things which have led to increased demand. The one piece of good news out of this is that the level of at least motor vehicle travel is not flatlining, but it's a very, very low rate of growth now compared to what it was in the last century. And so the demands in the future, although they're still going to be there, are not going to rise as fast as they have been. That's a very positive point. And we don't quite know why. Some of it is probably alluding to the recession we just went through. There was a downturn there in terms of travel because more people were out of work. But more likely it's societal change. There are a lot more people living in quasi-urban areas now of the county and who are foregoing that second car, or maybe in some cases that first car. And that helps things quite a bit. It helps stem the growth, but there's still a small amount of growth. So bottom line is the state has about $5 or $6 billion of projects that they spent millions of dollars on. They have no money to spend to build. The county has probably close to that amount of money in county road and transit projects that it wants to build that we don't have any money to build. We need lots of money. Thank you.